This is a production of Cornell University.
I wanted to start actually with a quick survey of how many of you have had some sort of intro ecology or environmental science at some point here. My guess was, well, I was going to guess about half. And so some of this may well be review and hearkening back to some of that, but you're going to get my perspective on climate change and terrestrial ecosystems, which is very carbon and nitrogen centric and focused on how it is that forests cycle carbon and how nitrogen can influence that, and how climate affects those overall processes and how those forests in turn can affect climate. I thought I'd start with an entertaining piece from the latest edition of The Onion, which is of course one of our very best news sources. It struck me again as to just how incredibly accurate they are. As you can see, this one is noting that the time to act is now. It says yellowing climate change report sitting in University Archive. If you can see the fine print, which you can't see from where you are, they claim this is 1994, which really wasn't all that long ago. In fact, scientists have been talking about climate change and the carbon cycle for much longer than that, and urging action. This is one of the early examples that I'm aware of. This is from the late 1970s, and one of the early papers synthesizing what we knew about the global carbon cycle then, and how terrestrial ecosystems interacted with the global carbon cycle. From 1978. And you see this now legendary figure showing the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere and the seasonal cycle of maximum values during the dormant season in the northern hemisphere and lowest concentrations during the summer when biology is taking up that CO2. And in this, they're demonstrating the important role of the terrestrial biosphere in regulating this atmospheric CO2 and trying to figure out its overall role in the overall carbon budget. Now, we can superimpose that on today's figure of mapping these same patterns of CO2 from the 1960s through to the present. We see the seasonal cycle continuing with this continuing upward trend. And we can superimpose that 1978 figure down in the very corner. They were on it early on, and you can see how much things have continued to change since. And you can see we continue to ignore the council from the late 1970s as we've continued to ignore the Onion reports. So anyway, human activities have driven this massive change in the global carbon cycle, reflected in this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Okay, to the point where most recently passed the 400 parts per million mark. I'm going to talk about the role of terrestrial ecosystems in climate change throughout today, and I'll focus on a couple of big questions. We're going to break it at least in my talk into two parts. The first is I'll ask how it is that terrestrial ecosystems affect climate change, and I really focus on their role in the carbon cycle. That is, what are these carbon sinks and why do they exist? And look at some of the evidence that suggests different mechanisms for why these carbon sinks exist. There are other ways that terrestrial ecosystems affect climate through their role in the energy budget, their albedo or reflectance capacity, and their ability to move water that also affect climate change, but I'm not going to be talking about those today within a short 50-minute time slot here. I'll then talk briefly in some short vignettes on how it is that climate change is projected to affect 3 different biomes, just a few slides on each on what some of the expectations are for the future there, especially their potential climate carbon feedbacks. Okay, I'll start with a figure you've likely seen several times on the fate of human-driven carbon dioxide. That is, the figure we just saw showed the dramatic increase in CO2 in the atmosphere that we've seen, driven by our emissions of fossil fuels. At the present day, or at least for the last decade, we've been emitting about 7.7 petagrams of carbon per year through fossil fuel combustion. In last year alone, we'd increased that another almost 30%. So substantial emissions of CO2. To that, we're also contributing to CO2 emissions through deforestation activities that convert carbon that's stored in biomass and releasing that as CO2 to the atmosphere. These two sources combined put almost 9 petagrams of carbon per year into the atmosphere. We can then follow the fate of that, of which only half ends up sticking around in the atmosphere and driving that steady increase. and CO2 that we see. This is where our ecosystem services become important. The oceans soak up about 1/4 of those emissions, largely through dissolution into the ocean surface. And then there's the terrestrial biosphere, which is taking up about 1/4 of all of our fossil fuel emissions. And so I'm going to focus very much on how it is that they're doing that. So they're providing us this great ecosystem service. If they weren't taking up this CO2, climate change would be happening all the more rapidly. The challenge is we don't understand entirely why they're doing that, and it's difficult to predict how they're going to behave into the future, whether they're continue to take up carbon dioxide or perhaps become sources. Now I'll step back. My first thing is, what is a carbon sink? And I do not mean this grody thing that you might find in a fraternity basement. No. When I'm talking carbon sinks, especially terrestrial carbon sinks, especially forest carbon sinks, I'm talking about some system or process or some ecosystem that accumulates and stores carbon over some particular time interval. We're usually mostly interested in time intervals of years or decades or somewhat longer time scale. That's driven, say for example, in a forest. This is a friendly sugar maple out on Mount Pleasant. That's driven by the process of photosynthesis that takes up large amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year. However, that alone does not make a carbon sink. Growth does indeed. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but plants use a lot of that for their own growth and maintenance, perhaps about half. We consider the balance of these net terms to be their net primary productivity or the net growth every year. That too doesn't quite make a carbon sink because herbivores and decomposing organisms also consume a lot of dead material every year. And we need to subtract off the balance of carbon loss to those processes to yield an overall net carbon sink within a particular ecosystem. In this particular forest, it's the balance of photosynthesis in minus these other respiratory and decomposition losses. And that ends up largely reflected as storage of carbon, say in the boles of trees, and a little bit of soil organic matter every year. So this is what we're thinking about in terms of longer-term storage of carbon within an ecosystem, at least within forest ecosystems. We can look at this carbon balance in a slightly different way, and I know you've seen some versions of this figure elsewhere, of looking at the distribution of carbon pools globally. And we can see these are roughly to scale. This is all the carbon that sits everywhere on Earth in the entire terrestrial biosphere. We see there's a heck of a lot more carbon here than there is up in the atmosphere, which forms a relatively small carbon pool. That atmospheric carbon content is changed by the fact that we're taking carbon from fossil fuel reserves and burning them and emitting them to the atmosphere every year, and combining that with the emissions from deforestation contributions to the atmosphere. So you might note these are pretty small numbers relative to this, but adding them every year has increased the amount of carbon sitting in that relatively small atmospheric carbon pool. As I noted, only half of that carbon that's emitted sticks around. About 1/4 of it ends up dissolving into the ocean. And that's largely driven by physical processes of dissolution into the surface ocean, where it causes a whole other set of issues that I'm not going to talk about because I'm talking solely about the terrestrial biosphere today. The taking of carbon up out of the atmosphere in terrestrial ecosystems is driven by biological processes. Once again, it's photosynthesis taking carbon out, and then processes of plant respiration and decomposition that are releasing carbon back to the atmosphere. And once again, you'll see that there are pretty big fluxes per year taking carbon out, and very much balanced by these decomposition and respiration processes releasing carbon back. These are really big numbers that have largely been in balance over much of Earth history, of carbon going into the biosphere balanced by decomposition out. It's now in this subtle imbalance by which the terrestrial biosphere is taking up a little bit more than it's releasing. That's what forms this net carbon sink. As you might imagine, it really then matters if we were to affect any of these processes. If you increase photosynthesis a little bit, you could take a lot more CO2 out of the atmosphere. If you ramp up decomposition, you could drastically pretty quickly convert a lot of the carbon in these pools back to this one. So a lot of what we do in ecosystem ecology is try to understand where and when that might occur. Okay, so why is it that the terrestrial biosphere is acting as a carbon sink? There's two broad groups of hypotheses to describe this. And the first is land use change. And that's happening literally in your backyard here out in Ithaca. And that is, it's reforestation after agricultural abandonment across much of the eastern US, and in fact, broad swaths of Europe as well. There was clearing of very large areas for agriculture. This is our neighbor state of Massachusetts, which you see was down to less than 30% forest cover in the 1800s, and is now well over 60%. Similar patterns occur throughout the eastern US. We can look at similar data for New York State, where we see both before, in the pre-settlement forest, there was virtually very little agriculture, and it was almost all forest. With the European settlers, forest cover decreased dramatically. And after about 1900, we turned the corner and regions started reforesting. This allows trees to regrow and reaccumulate carbon. And this process takes a really long time. These are some data from a while back within my lab, just showing the amount of carbon that can be stored of these different forests. Forests that have never been cleared, a primary forest, contain this much carbon, almost 350 tons of carbon per hectare. There's markedly less in these much younger forests. They have great capacity to continue accumulating carbon for many, many decades after plowing has ceased in woody biomass and in other carbon pools. So this is an example at the small scale by which terrestrial ecosystems can take up carbon. We can look at these processes across large regions. And these are data aggregated from forest inventories compiled across much of the northern hemisphere, and look at trends in tree biomass over the last 50, 60 years. Within that, we see that largely boreal regions like Asia and Russia and Canada have been pretty flat in the amount of carbon contained in trees in these regions. They've kind of gone up and down with cycles of large insect outbreaks and large fires, but have been relatively steady. And we can contrast that with the impressive increases of carbon storage here in the coterminous US and through several portions of Europe. These accumulations of carbon in woody biomass reflect this change in land use across these regions that have allowed them to temperate latitudes to take up carbon and form carbon storage. Okay, so that's one reason. The other reason for carbon sequestration is for some factor that may be stimulating plant growth, this really big flux of photosynthesis that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. There's several processes that can do that, and the one that gets the most attention is CO2 itself. As CO2 is increased in the atmosphere, it allows some plants, in fact, the dominant plant forms on Earth, C3 plants, to grow more rapidly than they would without that CO2. There are a few other processes as well. We may be inadvertently fertilizing our forest through air pollution, nitrogen and air pollution. You add nitrogen to your garden for a reason. Well, we expect that, in fact, nitrogen and air pollution could provide a small contribution of increasing forest growth. And then climate change itself, in some regions, allows a longer growing season, somewhat warmer conditions, and may allow more rapid growth to occur. Now, to figure out how important these are, we can look, for example, at a now classic experiment down at the Duke Forest, in which scientists created these large rings, which you can see here. These are rings of PVC pipes with perforations in them. And at half of these pipes, they were blowing simply ambient air onto these young 16-year-old loblolly pine trees. And the other ones, they bolstered it with CO2. There we go. This giant tank shows the amount of CO2 they were going through every week just to run this experiment and just to create the amount of CO2 inside these little 30-meter rings that we expect the entire planet to experience by about the year 2050. So they've increased the CO2 concentration experimentally and wanted to see what happened to growth. Well, these are some of the results. They turned the gas on here, and pretty quickly we see the elevated CO2 trees starting to gain more in the basal area incremental growth of these trees relative to the unamended trees. It's about a 20% growth enhancement. There have since been about a half dozen similar experiments in forests, and they tend to show pretty broadly comparable results of about 15, 18, 20% growth enhancement in young forests in these experimental conditions. Well, the modelers, and you've heard quite a bit about the modelers, I think, this semester, those who are projecting future climate change and trying to put the carbon cycle into these models as best they can to predict future CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. They're simulating land uptake of CO2, and they've included this CO2 fertilization effect that is based on what's understood from plant physiology in this sense. These are projections of the terrestrial carbon sink, which we talked earlier is about 2 petagrams per year today, shown here by this little red line. Each color here is a different model, and you see, well, maybe broadly, they're roughly getting the estimated 2 petagrams of carbon sequestration about now. If we look into the future, up to the year 2100, they do this. They're all over the place. And so one of our challenges is to try and figure out how these processes work so that we can understand them better. Arguably, most of these models, or the majority of the models, have relatively optimistic scenarios about CO2 fertilization and plant growth into the future. A couple of them have extremely optimistic scenarios on how much more trees are going to grow. And a couple of them sort of crash. I forget whether it's the Amazon drying up or burning up or something along those lines. But as it is, there's great uncertainty with what the future is going to look like according to these models. But they do all have fairly healthy CO2 fertilization effects in them. Well, we can now begin to test this. One of the questions has long been, what about the long term? What if you run out of nitrogen? What if there's insufficient water? We have a nice recent analysis that have been able to compare satellite observations with models. That is, there have been Landsat satellites up for 30 years now, more than 30 years now. And from that, we can look at how much growth has changed over this period. And this is a global map of the percent change in growth, their primary productivity over this 30-year time period. And you see there's some red zones where growth has gone down a bit, and some blue and green zones where it's gone up. Globally, there's an overall net increase of about 2.8% growth increase over this 30-year time period. So indeed, growth has increased. Back to the question, are we simply regrowing forests and taking up carbon, or have we enhanced growth? Well, the answer is probably a bit of both. And we can see some evidence for growth enhancement in these data. Really valuable data set. However, we can then compare this with what the models estimate for the same time period. And they're estimating about 3 times the magnitude of growth enhancement due to CO2 fertilization as is discerned from the satellite record. And the authors of this paper suggest, well, it could be a number of different things, but through a couple of lines of evidence, they suggest that perhaps it's that the models simply have too generous of a CO2 fertilization effect. Well, why is that? As one who studies nitrogen near and dear, I would argue that it's, in all likelihood, the fact that these models rarely include a nitrogen cycle in their model. Plants need not just carbon and water, they also need nutrients. And there are increasingly a couple of models that are beginning to try and include the nitrogen cycle. You're all excited about the nitrogen cycle, I can tell. It's not so easy to do, but there are a few models that have tried it, and this is one example. In those models that have only a carbon cycle in them, they have a generous increase in carbon storage for every part per million increased CO2 in the atmosphere. This is one example of a model that has a nitrogen cycle. Simply suggests that there ain't enough nitrogen there to allow that CO2 fertilization to occur in these simulations. So this is one example where there's a much smaller CO2 fertilization because there isn't enough nitrogen. So we think CO2 fertilization will allow some degree of carbon storage into the future. A question is how much nitrogen there is. I mentioned that, in fact, we're doing other things with nitrogen that may inadvertently fertilize forests. And I'll spend just one slide talking about that. This is work by a former graduate student of mine who looked to try and tease out whether or not there was an effect of air pollution, nitrogen and air pollution on forest growth. And he looked at 10,000 plots in the US forest inventory across the northeastern US. He looked at the growth trends in 24 tree species across this region. Across this region, nitrogen deposition goes from very low to sort of moderate levels. And it turns out that there were 8 species that had statistically significant, 11 species that had statistically significant increases in their growth rates with increasing nitrogen deposition rates, shown here in different colors. And there's some of your favorites, red maple, sugar maple, black cherry, several of those species. There were 3 that in fact grew more poorly with increasing nitrogen. One of them, this guy here, red pine, is one that happens to have been killed in some long-term fertilizer experiments. Seeing results like that actually made me believe I think we're getting something real in this analysis. And then there's a whole bunch of other species that really don't respond. And so like many things in ecology, we often end up with a response that it sort of depends on which species you're looking at as to what the overall effect will be. Some species will thrive with this response, and others may suffer. The overall net response of northeastern forests was for a modest degree of growth enhancement from this nitrogen fertilization. So in some cases, that combination of a little nitrogen fertilization, a little CO2 fertilization, inadvertently we could be fertilizing our forests and providing a small benefit, I'll note, a small benefit to offset a small piece of our fossil fuel emissions. Fossil fuel emissions are much, much larger than this extra stimulation. Okay. I wanted to review here how it is terrestrial ecosystems affect climate largely through the carbon cycle. There are several processes involved. We think some of this carbon sink, carbon sequestration is driven by forest regrowth, and some of it is likely from enhanced growth, from both CO2 and from nitrogen, possibly other factors as well. I'm going to take a quick tour, say a tour of 3 biomes, as to how it is roughly that we expect climate change to affect some important terrestrial ecosystems. And I'll focus here on carbon climate feedbacks. That is, in this case, I know you've talked about feedbacks. Again, a positive feedback doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. A positive feedback means it amplifies the process. So you get a change in one factor that's going to drive that system in a way that amplifies the initial change. So you have CO2 in the atmosphere that drives warming. That warming process might release more carbon to the atmosphere that then perpetuates additional warming. And each of these systems has some capacity for those sorts of feedbacks. Others have negative feedbacks, and CO2 fertilization is an example of negative feedbacks by which you put more CO2 in the atmosphere. You get growth that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere. Okay. Tropical forests. There are several factors that are interacting here to provide feedbacks into the climate system. One are these projections. I mentioned that one model had a sort of a really wacky dire projection of die-off from drought in the Amazon. Many of the models do project some degree of drought within the Amazon system. Much of the Amazon, at least the southern portion of the Amazon, is a seasonally dry forest to begin with, and there are some projections that some portions of it may get drier into the future. One of the questions has been the extent to which that may cause tree mortality or increase the likelihood of fire within these ecosystems. And you can't talk about tropical forests and carbon without also concurrently talking about the role of deforestation as well. This important process I've noted that contributes about 11% of the current global CO2 emissions is from tropical deforestation. And some of these factors, again, so deforestation is contributing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and it may also then concurrently enhance likelihood of future fire. So the role of drought, I wanted to find one example of a specific climate change effect on tropical ecosystems. Another case, this is another example of an ecosystem experiment, like that CO2 ecosystem experiment. This one, some ecosystem ecologists took these giant panels, you see these plastic covered panels, and they diverted all the rainfall on this 1 hectare plot, which is about 2.5 acres, 100 meters by 100 meters. And they managed to, again, intercept off about half of the incoming rainfall for several years, trying to simulate what would a drought experience be like on a pretty large area. What they found was, in fact, the trees did better than they thought. A lot of these are extremely deep-rooted trees that can access very deep groundwater sources. And many of these trees persisted much longer than they were initially expecting. after this 3-year prolonged exposure to drought, that was when they did indeed begin to impose some mortality. What this suggests is that if there's increasing frequency of, say, El Nino, and it's, say, a single bad year, trees may be able to do pretty well. You start pushing the forest into a really altered state shift, and they may well struggle. But there was greater resilience there than they had initially expected. This is a figure here, the left and right, is both showing the same projection of drought within the Amazon by a series of different ensemble model simulations, basically showing that within most of the model simulations, again, the projections are for some degree of increased drought in the southeastern portion of the Amazon. And over that is superimposed the red areas, or these expected deforestation areas driven by human activities. And part of this interacted with the social science of what is it that drives where and why people deforest land areas. These projections were expecting that by the mid-century there could be almost quite substantial losses of forest under the business as usual scenarios, but if there was increased governance and regulation, that could be diminished by perhaps half. In fact, there has been great progress there. Current deforestation rates are closer to this trajectory than to what they had been. I noted at the start, in the global carbon cycle, deforestation is about little over 1 petagram per year. That's driven by tropical regions. Most of the temperate regions are in a net regrowth phase. And meanwhile, most of these tropical regions are releasing carbon dioxide through deforestation. And we can see these trends of very flat rates, but with big spikes beginning into the 60s or so. But I'll note the global total is here, again at a little over 1 petagram per year. And we see that within Africa, they've been relatively low rates to date, but are increasing. Similarly for Asia. The expectation is that South America may well have peaked in its rates of deforestation in past decades and may well be declining. One of the challenges with deforestation, and there is continued deforestation even if the rates have gone down, is that fire often accompanies deforestation. You can see here in this image, I'm not sure how well it'll show in the lighting in the back, there's this kind of classic, almost fishbone-looking pattern you can see. First off, there's clouds. It's often clouds in rainforest areas. And then there's also a smoke contribution in that this is areas undergoing active deforestation. If you have a chance to go on Google Earth, you can see these sort of fishbony patterns just going in from Google Earth. These are areas of deforestation in which early roads had been punched into the landscape, and then deforestation then follows the access of those roads. Following roads and deforestation comes fire. And for a couple of reasons, this is an example of one of these fires. These ecosystems are not adapted to fire. Some of our Western ecosystems and southern US systems are indeed adapted to regular fire that don't do much damage. These forests tend not to be adapted to fire. Typically, in the classic rainforest sense, the interior is dark and very humid, and they survive their dry season because they have these deep roots that allow them to access water. The natural fire incidence in these ecosystems is very, very long, on the order of many hundreds to maybe thousands of years. And they don't do well when fire does come through. The small ground fires even can kill these trees. But when you do have an opening up of the forest through deforestation, and with, in addition to wholesale deforestation, say clear-cut scenarios, when folks come through to, say, pull out a few valuable timber trees, they often end up doing more damage than just those individual trees. And they punch small holes in the canopy that allow sunlight, that hot tropical sunlight, to beam down into the forest and often dry out the forest floor. That combination of things makes that system much more vulnerable to fire that is often used as a land clearing tool. So settlers in the region can come in and both intentionally and unintentionally set fires. Some of these fires, again, are intentionally set to clear the land. Other times they escape and hit other regions. And once that ecosystem is this originally humid, intact ecosystem is opened up, it becomes much more vulnerable to fire. So this can set up a cycle in combination of this disturbance to the landscape through deforestation and forest degradation, that enable it to become more vulnerable to fire in the future, especially when it's interacting under conditions of increased drought, such as those that are projected for the future. Additional ecological feedbacks can occur whereby some of these intact ecosystems may allow invasive grasses that burn very easily come in, that are better adapted to fire ecosystems come in, but then can burn again quite regularly. So our vignette for the tropics is this story of drought and potential fire interacting with deforestation. There's concern, I don't want to be runaway gloom and doom, and again, just like the model that completely sank. The question is, are we looking at a runaway scenario? And there are some early model simulations that suggested the entire Amazon might dry up simply because of climate change and that plants would not be able to survive. More recently, however, we have both these experiments and model examples that suggest that these forests may well be more resistant to drought than initially projected. Indeed, there may be some impact on growth, but they may be more resistant. And this runaway die-off scenario may be less likely. But trying to get all the complexity of these interactions of deforestation plus the climate interaction is a difficult one and an active area of work. And to note, however, deforestation has decreased. At least between 2004 and 2011, it dropped down to about a quarter of what it was. And whether they can maintain these low levels of deforestation amidst the current strife, we'll wait to see. Okay, so what I want to say about the tropics, and I've got a little bit. I can walk through, intentionally very briefly, talk about northern systems and some of these important carbon climate feedbacks, and then our local temperate forests. When I think about the north, we think about frozen, we think about ice. And one of the most important terrestrial carbon cycle feedbacks, or potential feedbacks, has to do with the thawing of frozen soil, thawing of frozen soil and potential creation of peatlands and potential drying of peatlands. These are enormous stocks of carbon. The numbers are not very good, I'll add at that too. The numbers have changed in recent years quite a bit. It's really hard to measure the entire terrestrial stock of carbon sitting in these frozen soils way the heck up in the middle of the Arctic. So these numbers have changed dramatically, and they keep going up the more we keep finding more carbon, it seems. But you'll note that these are the best estimates to date, and these are on the order of at least 3 times more carbon sitting in there in frozen or waterlogged soils relative to the entire amount of carbon stored in every tree added up together on the planet. So there's lots of carbon sitting here in this relatively accessible form, or so we think, should that begin to thaw. So there are some examples of thawing of some of these ancient carbon-rich soils. This here is an ancient, you could see it as literally dark. It's a very dark soil, a very carbon-rich soil that's been exposed in a river cut area, in an area up in Siberia that's currently thawing out. And in that, this is a close-up of some ancient roots that have been dated to be 30,000 years old, that have just been uncovered through this combination of thawing and river cut process. So we're exposing some previously frozen material is now becoming unthawed and available, or becoming thawed, unfrozen, and is available to decomposition. Now a simple takeaway that for those of you that hadn't had biology before, a simple takeaway is that decomposition increases exponentially with increasing temperature. And you know this from your personal experience. If you have a pound of chicken and leave it in the freezer, it'll stay frozen as a pound of chicken, semi-recognizable, for a very, very long time, years perhaps. You could still take it out and thaw it, and it might have freezer burn, but that pound of chicken has not frozen all that much. You stick it in the refrigerator, above freezing in most of our refrigerators, it will thaw, and if you let it sit there for long enough, you will notice by sniff test that it has begun to decompose. You then stick that pound of chicken on your kitchen counter. Again, markedly warmer than your refrigerator, and you know that that is really decomposing really fast. So you can use that as your qualitative example here, that indeed you go from a completely frozen state, that carbon can sit there for a long time and not much decomposition is occurring to it at all. Once that becomes thawed, it then becomes available to a whole range of different microbes to act on that material and to undergo some decomposition. And then once you start really warming it up, we tend to think of that decomposition rate as roughly doubling for every 10-degree increase in temperature. Global projections for the end of the century are maybe 4 or 5 degrees. So that's a pretty significant increase in potential decomposition rates. Okay, so I noted that way back at the start, we have this big global carbon cycle. There are gigantic fluxes of carbon into the biosphere and gigantic ones out. And there's really great potential to increase this decomposition of material that's been frozen or material that's stored in soil organic matter. So we have this important feedback of increasing temperature is going to increase decomposition rate. And we know that there's, again, huge quantities of carbon sitting here in these frozen and waterlogged soils, and in soils in this part of the world as well. One of the big questions among soil scientists and ecosystem ecologists is how much of this soil carbon pool really will be vulnerable to this exponential rate of decomposition. The good news is that we think not all of it will be vulnerable to decomposition. What we don't know is what fraction of this material, and again, there's a lot of it. There's an awful lot of it here relative to the amount in vegetation. There's a lot of it here relative to the amount in the atmosphere. And yet we do increasingly think that not all of it will likely be vulnerable to this increased decomposition rate. Some of it may well stay frozen for a long time. Other components of it may well become difficult for microbes to get at for a range of other reasons having to do with physical chemistry and such. But that's an important long-term question. One of the other ones is what happens to the plants in these ecosystems? These are systems that are frozen for a goodly part of the year. It's difficult for trees to grow. We do think, in fact, that tree growth probably will increase in this part of the world. Those little shrivelly little boreal trees may well be able to grow faster and take up a little bit more carbon. And we expect to start getting trees in some parts of the tundra that didn't have them before. That has a range of positive and negative consequences for those ecosystems, and it's not likely to provide all that much in the way of an overall carbon sink. The last potential important feedback in this region that you can't not mention is methane. And that's thinking about decomposition. When decomposition occurs under saturated conditions, much of what comes off is not necessarily CO2, but it comes off as methane, as this decomposition product. This material that may be frozen for a very long time, as it thaws out, the microbes get at it and do their stuff. Some of it comes off as CO2. The stuff that comes off in saturated soils often comes off as methane. I think I've still got 10 minutes. Okay. What we don't know, and this is one of perhaps the runaway scenario that tends to worry me the most, is what fraction of this portion of high northern landscapes will become thawed and decomposed, and how much is going to come off as methane. But yet we don't know to what extent wetlands that will be newly created by this thawing process might be balanced by the drying out of some of our existing wetlands, as essentially the prairies push up into some of these northern high latitude ecosystems. So indeed, we'll be creating some new wetlands through thawing. We may well be changing some of the dynamics of what is currently acting as wetlands and methane emitting systems in that part of the world. And again, the reason we care about this difference is because of the molecule per molecule effect of methane relative to CO2. Okay. So we've gone to the tropics, we've gone to the high north. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about our local ecosystems, local temperate here and a little bit out west. And I've made a case early on that I think temperate forests are currently pretty important carbon sinks, largely through land use change and a couple of other factors. We can look at the projected warming for this part of the world. Here we are in New York State. We can look under we're essentially on the higher CO2 emissions trajectory. which would put us by the end of the century with the climate of something like down here in South Carolina and Georgia by the end of the century, if you want a comparable climate analog. Some of our best ways of trying to estimate what life is going to be like in the future are by taking these model projections and spinning them forward. We can look at simulations of what we expect growth to be like for various northeastern tree species. This is simulation of forest growth for 5 different northeastern forest sites. These ones that are up here and all looking sort of happily increasing in their growth over time are a bunch of deciduous hardwood species. This rather sad looking blue line is spruce fir, which at least model simulations suggest may well hit climate conditions that exceeds its adaptive tolerance at this stage. You also see these 2 panels illustrate, once again, the importance of a CO2 fertilization effect. In the model, you can include a CO2 fertilization effect, which suggests things may be rosy into the future. If you exclude the CO2 fertilization effect, you get relatively flat simulations of future growth into the future, which is neither good nor bad. You simply have no growth enhancement, but neither is there no growth impairment due to future climate warming. But for our poor friend, the spruce fir, which if any of you have visited mountaintops, you may know so the spruce fir exists in many of our mountaintop and high northern ecosystems in the Northeast as it is. And they were already challenged by many decades of air pollution. The good news is air pollution is getting a heck of a lot better, and so many of these trees are actually beginning to grow better again now than in the past. The question is how they'll do in the face of future climate change. One way to look at these projections are to look at essentially the climate envelope in which different species occur now and where those climate values will be in the future. And that we can take, for example, this panel up top shows a distribution of where different forest types are today. And this sort of aqua blue color represents where spruce fir exists. And again, much of Maine and some little pockets in the Adirondacks and the northern Vermont and northern New Hampshire. Much of this, the rest of the region is this pinky purple color, which is our classic northern hardwood maple beech birch forest. If we look at where those climate conditions are likely to be, either a low CO2 emissions scenario, low climate change, or a high climate change scenario, neither one of these future scenarios has climate conditions in which spruce fir is expected to be able to do all that well. There's virtually no aqua left within these maps by the end of the century under either of the emissions scenarios. And you see our current maple beech birch forest having appropriate habitat for it, moving up into the Adirondack regions, end of the high emission scenario, and somewhat larger regions that are lower emission scenarios, being replaced by an oak hickory or oak pine forest moving in from the south. One question is how quickly forests can move. I'm not sure about you, I haven't seen trees walk all that quickly. It can take a while, and we're talking here about scenarios of climate change by a century. If you're out in Ithaca, you'll see a lot of trees that are more than a century old. So a real question here is that is how quickly those tree species can change their location relative to the swiftness with which the climate is changing. And our models are not very good at making those predictions yet. They can say where they ultimately might be, but they're not very good at predicting how quickly they might be able to migrate. Okay, I just want to spend the last few minutes noting some other interactions, and here looking at some other species interactions rather than just direct effects of climate change on the tree physiology and growth rates. Climate change can interact with some of the insect pests and pathogens on these different forest ecosystems. This is an example, we just found some of this down around Beebe Lake, of an invasive insect pest, the Hemlock woolly adelgid. It's so cute, it looks like little cotton balls here. What this is, it's a little insect that taps into the phloem of the tree and sort of sucks the nutrients out, and has killed large stands of hemlock down through Connecticut. Again, it's an invasive species. But its northern limit is set by cold winter temperatures. So these are data looking at the the proportion of adelgid that are dead through various trials as a function of overwinter temperature. And so when it's really cold, you get almost 100% dead. When it's mean temperatures during winter are above zero, you only kill about 15-20% of them. So the abundance of this insect is in part driven by mean cold winter temperatures. As those change, we expect the northern range limit of this insect to change and allow it to hit hemlock farther and farther north. If you've been out in the western US, I'm assuming we probably have some Coloradans, Utahns, Arizonans. You probably have encountered scenarios like this, which is this is the western park of Rocky Mountain National Park. And as an Easterner, I'm sort of used to this time of year looking around and seeing a lot of gray wood forests. This is August, looking across a lodgepole pine forest. And all of this gray, nearly as far as the eye can see, is beetle-killed forest that's been killed by the western pine beetle. There are a few little patches of green down here, which are young forests that have been clear-cut a few earlier, and the beetles didn't bother to hit those young stands. And they're more able to get at the old stands to begin with. So the little young stands that have been cut survived, and pretty much everything else is killed in this viewpoint. So this is a native insect, unlike the invasive that I just talked about. But it is helped by climate change, and that is that fewer are killed over the cold winters. And so you end up with this insect occurring at higher latitudes and higher elevations than it did in the past. Some of the trees that it kills are those that are somewhat vulnerable to drought. That makes them somewhat weaker and less able to fight off the insect. And you can sometimes get 2 life cycles per year rather than 1 of this insect. And anytime you get a population doubling like that, the populations explode very, very swiftly. So these things combined have led to this unprecedented eruption of mountain pine beetle. So these are interactions that are sort of the next trophic level up by ways in which climate change can impact our forests. So I'll note in general that our temperate forests, again, are the home to most of us. They are presently carbon sinks. We think that the appropriate habitat for most of them is likely to shift into the future. We don't know how long it'll take for these forests to shift. That remains a question. And we think in general, this is an example of where forest pests and oftentimes weedy, quick-growing, quickly moving species have some sort of a strategic advantage. Some forests, like our spruce fir forests, may have particular challenges going forward, but other trees are doing pretty well, and we expect to do well, and we can think even about those as a resource toward forest management, possibly thinking about using them for heat or other biofuels in substitution for biofuels, which is an activity under some discussion. So a few take-homes, it's just that terrestrial carbon sinks, or terrestrial ecosystems are carbon sinks. So thank your terrestrial carbon ecosystems. If it weren't for them, we'd be warming up the planet that much faster. We think it's due to this combination of temperate ecosystem regrowth from past land use and modest growth enhancements from a number of different factors. CO2 is one, but probably not as much CO2 fertilization as the rather optimistic models have been projecting. And one of the great activities of ecosystem ecology is trying to figure out whether these carbon sinks are going to persist, get bigger, or turn into carbon sources as we go into the future into response to this range of change. And I've been very carbon-centric in this story here, which is indeed only part of the story. The role of ecosystems in affecting direct energy balance and driving species changes and providing a range of ecosystem services will all be affected as we go forward. But I'll stop there with my carbon-centric view for now. Thanks.
For those of you who are going to stick around, we'll take questions now. If you have a question, just kind of raise your hand and I'll come to you with the microphone.
Hi, I was just wondering, with the models that you showed, did they, how many factors went into the proposed model? Was it just, carbon, was it just the increase of carbon dioxide, or did you also take into account albedo and pests and everything else?
And I'm not sure, I should stand near the microphone. Let's see, it depends on which model. When I was just predicting future growth within the Northeast, those are just sort of looking at the role of climate and CO2 and nitrogen deposition. not pests. None of the models that I'm aware of have pests in them integrated. Some of the land surface climate models that are predicting the entire climate system and carbon cycle into the futures, those do have albedo and land surface energy processes in them. And some are more carbon cycle only.
Do you think that we have enough, do you think these models individually are accurate enough that you can actually combine them yet, or are they just not developing?
They're all developing in different ways. Well, some of them are converging. It's probably good for them to develop in different ways because you can explore different sets of questions. Some of them are better and worse than others, including the nitrogen cycle has been an example of one where we're trying now to include it, but it's sometimes a head scratcher as to whether we're improving things or making it more complicated than the data or our understanding should inform us to do.
What is the role, in your view, of agroforestry? In particular, I'm thinking of the net effect of some that has gotten a lot of press, like palm oil palms.
Ah, okay, oil palm. And I'm not an expert on this. Other than that, I understand that that has been one of the major factors that's been behind clearing of forests and peatlands in Indonesia, which has been one of the biggest perturbations in terms of deforestation, land use emissions. So I showed data from the Amazon where things are getting better. They've been getting way worse in Southeast Asia. And I think that from a carbon standpoint, they're pretty dreadful. Yeah. From my marginally informed opinion on that one.
So I recently heard a talk about a study that showed increased use of compost could help grasslands become bigger carbon sinks.
Uh-huh.
And I was wondering how much you think that as humans we should be looking to change or alter our current terrestrial ecosystems in a way that could reduce climate change.
Yeah. It varies. So the quick answer is that it varies depending on what sort of modification you're talking about. This specific one, adding compost to grasslands, is one that's good for a whole bunch of reasons, whether it's adding to grasslands or adding to agricultural regions. Increasing the carbon storage of soil is good for a bunch of reasons. You increase the water holding capacity, the cation retention capacity, all sorts of good things there. The carbon storage is usually pretty marginal. I'm a forest ecologist both because I love trees and because they store gobs of carbon. You store a heck of a lot more carbon in a woody bowl than you do in some grass blades. And the rate of soil carbon accumulation tends to be very, very slow. So in terms of carbon storage, there's nothing wrong with it. You could accumulate some and you can have multiple co-benefits. But from a strictly carbon storage standpoint, it's pretty small.
Hi, Christy. This is a question with respect to the tropical forest explicitly. I've been to a couple of seminars in the past here on Cornell where it was suggested that some of the tropical forests would have actual temperature limits and temperature-triggered mortality, and that they haven't seen, they've been so stable in their temperature regime for so long that they really haven't seen the kind of variation that we've had in temperate forests, and that they'd be very susceptible to that. Is there any evidence in your opinion for that?
I likely know the same studies that you do, which would suggest there are some species that may be at that. And it's one of the things that it took me a really long time to even make that connection of just recognizing that, say, temperate boreal species experience enormous variations annually in temperature, that they have to adapt to a pretty big range. But tropical species have that really narrow adaptation window. So that in many ways, they may be more vulnerable to climate change than higher latitude species. Again, I know there were some studies that suggested that they were hitting that range. I don't know how widespread that phenomenon is, and if others have supported that. Others may know as well. Yeah.
From the point of view of forest management, I wonder if you have any opinion on managing forests for carbon absorption. Is new growth better than old growth? Is like managing forests so that there is a judicious upper story, or how is the best way to maximize carbon storage of a
that you'll get some strong opinions on that one from different people, and it gets complicated fast, because as I think you're alluding to, an old forest has a lot of carbon sitting there, but typically their growth rates or their net carbon sink rate is pretty small, so that they've already accumulated lots of carbon, such that if you clear that, you've just provided an opportunity to take what was an ample carbon store that was there and emit that to the atmosphere. Some might suggest harvesting them and sinking them to the bottom of Lake Superior would be a way of storing that carbon long term. I'm not advocating that as a strategy. Because indeed it is the young forests that do take up carbon out of the atmosphere most quickly. Typically the situations where that makes sense is where you have what is currently an open field or pasture land of some sort. Then if you do put young trees there, they can gain a lot of carbon quickly. When you take intact forest and convert it to young forest, you have to consider the carbon losses from what that forest was in place there. And some of the early regulations, I'm not sure if it was EPA or otherwise, failed to put that into consideration. They were trying to credit simply a certain amount of credit for growing carbon, but they weren't putting in the appropriate discount factors for what happened if you had what already was a large carbon store and then cut it down so that you could have young trees. So you really do need to consider that whole land use factor in that management scenario, just to add complication. Is that what you're thinking of, those challenges? Okay.
All right. Well, if no one has any more questions, let's thank Christy one more time.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.